enjoy the show.
I'm so happy to welcome you all to the White River Valley Museum tonight. I'm Hillary Pittenger. I'm the curator of collections here, which means I take care of all artifacts and do research and generally have a really awesome job. And I have been so delighted to work with Paul and SPLAB on archiving their collection and getting this set up tonight for all of you to enjoy and hear about SPLAB's great work. I'd love to start off with acknowledging that we are on the ancestral lands of the Muckleshoot tribe and the Muckleshoot peoples. We're surrounded by their language, by their art and the fact, and we're really indebted to them for their generosity for allowing us to be here and continuing to support us today. I'd like to introduce our MC for the evening, Matt Priest. He is a poet, a digital artist, a teacher, probably lots of other titles as well. He is the author of Later Heaven production cycles and has collaborated with Paul and SPLAB for a long time on a variety of projects. But the one that I liked most when I was looking at the work was the Postcards in the Park. I think that was super cool. So I'm sure he has lots more to tell you about SPLAB, and please give him a welcome.
Donated collection for SPLAB, yes, and how they might be able to access that.
Yes, so I think about 11 months or so ago, I was invited to Paul and Baptiste's home, and they showed me the amazing collection of all the back tapes of all the interviews that Paul has done in his various nonprofit radio work with Peer Radio Productions and the many permutations of that work and those organizations. It is many, many hundreds of tapes and CDs, probably about 1,000 total interviews, some of which are duplicates or edits of the same material, but nonetheless, we still catalog all of it. And he generously offered it to our institution since he was so focused down here in South King County for so long with a lot of that work, and we were so grateful to be able to take it into our collection. So what that means is that over the next few years, as it is a fairly large collection, it'll take us some time, we will digitize those things, which are not already digital, and get everything cataloged into our collection database where it can go online and be accessible for free to anyone who visits the museum website anytime. We just finished a smaller version of a project like this with our oral histories, so if you'd like, you can go on our website and see kind of what it would look like. Where you can go, there will be all sorts of keyword searches, so folks can find the many, many great thinkers that he interviewed over the years and find out where to access more information about them, and yeah, be able to hear it for free forever.
Well, thank you very much.
This is so great.
I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. This is 25 years. It's quite an endeavor, and SPLAB has kind of touched a lot of parts of the entire bioregion. So it's great to see a lot of you out here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Barbara McMichael, who runs the Southern County SoCo Culture, which exists to make sure that all cultural assets know about all.
I'll just talk about it.
Okay, yeah. She's going to come up and talk about art in Southern King County. So.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm supposed to say that I represent For Culture. For Culture, here we go, it's a mini civics lesson. For Culture is the cultural services agency of King County. Anytime anybody stays in a hotel or motel in King County, a tiny portion of the lodging tax that they pay goes to For Culture. For Culture redistributes it out throughout the county to different arts and heritage and so on. Okay, so here in South King County, we have SoCo Culture, which is an umbrella organization of arts and heritage and botanical groups. And SoCo Culture, I've been working with them for 10, maybe 12 years. Serves to kind of connect people, make sure that they aren't working in a vacuum, provides professional development, and so on. Well, long before SoCo Culture came to South King County, Paul Nelson came. And he came to Auburn, and he started doing things just because he's a force of nature unto himself. So I've made a few little notes about what I want to talk about. Paul is all about connecting people and ideas, and Patricia Cosgrove, who is the just recently retired director of the White River Valley Museum, called him. I was talking with her about him the other day, and she said he was our resident guru of deep thought, poetry, and intellectualism. Which is a pretty nice thing to say. So, some of the things that he was involved in, and I wasn't even aware of these because I was off doing other things like raising little children at the time when he first started, but he was involved with and emceed a local celebration of talent called Uniquely Auburn, and for his radio programs, he interviewed over 1,000 interviews, which is what's going to be in the museum, and many of them were locals. You know, think globally, but act locally. He was talking to local historians and local politicians and local people on the street, capturing what Auburn was about. He founded his nonprofit organization at Place in Peoria in Auburn. He built a studio and a poetry center in Auburn, Global Voices Radio, Auburn Community Radio, SPLAB. He began, while he was in Auburn, he co-founded the August Poetry Postcard Project, which I participated in a couple of times, and that has grown into an international endeavor. Poets around the world are connected with one another, writing poems and sending them off to one another via postcard throughout the month of August. And that's just about the most beautiful thing I can imagine. And it started all here in Auburn with Paul. He began espousing the importance of American sentences as a poetry form. I think it was originated with Ginsberg, but Paul is the person who's kept it going. It's a discipline that he has been practicing every day for the last 20-some years, probably, something like that. Am I right? And I've tried that for maybe a year, and it is a discipline. And it's for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's kind of adopting from haiku. I mean, it's the 17 syllables, but it's capturing what you see in a moment here on the American landscape. So that's been a pretty special thing. And then from the tiny to the enormous, or the epic, he also wrote this book, A Time Before Slaughter. And this is an epic poem about the prehistory and early history of Auburn, which originally was named after a military officer, Slaughter, and it was kind of awkward because, you know, the train would come into town and say, you know, everybody for Slaughter, and, you know, it sounded like that. So anyway, but for a city or a town of our size, you know, to have somebody devote his time in doing the historical research and the creative endeavor in creating an epic poem, it's a real tribute to the community and a marvelous gift of your creative input. So that's just something that Auburn can be very proud of. I want to go back to, these American sentences. I asked Paul to share a couple of Auburn-specific American sentences that I could share with you tonight. And I have a couple here. One from 2003. Here's an American sentence from Paul. Raphael says, "Why didn't they just take off the S and make it laughter?" Getting it? I like it, okay. One from March 2004, and I'll just preface this by saying that the 150 is our bus route that goes from Auburn to Seattle.
Goes to Kent now.
Things change, all right. But here's a thought. The 150 drives by on D Street, and all the wood frogs go silent. Here's one from a little later. I've messed up with the timing a little bit. middle of the bike rack in front of Auburn City Hall, big spider web. And here's one from November 2006. And Rebecca is Paul's daughter. Words Rebecca should not say in debate class: gangster, Jew, and douchebag. Now, if any of you subscribe to SPLAB and get Paul's, email missives, you'll know that he was, by the time Rebecca was in high school, he was really kind of jonesing to move on, but he was committed to staying here, and Rebecca had formed some strong relationships and was doing well in school, and so he wasn't going to disrupt that. And so once she graduated and moved on, spread her wings and flew, Paul also left Auburn. And it was to my chagrin, but I'm glad he didn't go far. But we had a chance to have this kind of intellectual ferment and enthusiasm for the community right here in Auburn for a good amount of time. And he hasn't completely left yet. I should have written this one down too, but here in this book, he has a passage about a cedar tree that is just around the corner, just over where the activity center is. And it's something that we have shared on our SoCo Culture website. We're doing a collection of trees that are culturally significant in Auburn. And I said, Paul, don't you have something about that? And so he has shared that excerpt about that tree. So I invite you to go to the SoCo Culture website and look up trees and see his poem there. Anyway, I'm really glad to be here tonight. I'm glad all of you are here tonight. It's a good evening to celebrate. Thank you, Paul.
Next up, we're going to have former Auburn Mayor Pete Lewis is going to speak about SPLAB's Auburn tenure.
So I'm not exactly sure why I was asked to speak. I like that phrase, intellectual ferment. That could really describe his entire time in the city of Auburn. Don't you think?
There was a lot of fermentation.
Of all sorts of kinds. But my relationship with Paul started almost immediately when I was in office. And Paul would come into my office quite often, and he would start off, well, so, you know, and then I knew I had a problem. I didn't have a problem anymore, but I had a problem immediately. Sometimes it was because, now, Paul had a studio, and it was on Division, and he was having problems, and he was going to get to another place, and he and I were talking about, you've got city property, I could use a piece of city property. Auburn doesn't have any property. I mean, any property it really owns is full. Usually it's overfull, because it doesn't buy buildings, it doesn't buy stuff a lot. Or did it then. And we had the train station. And we had ownership of little parts and pieces of the building. And he was having a problem. It was nothing new. But he was having a problem. And I had an access to a little piece of the building. So we talked and moved Paul in there, and he would say things like, well, we're a radio station, and if we just did some things, this would work a lot better. So you mean we could make the signal bigger? Yeah, we could do that. How? I don't know. I don't know anything about that. And every time we would do something, it was really funny, because Paul would walk in my office, and if he came in, it was like, when he'd go and sit down, I'd say, okay, now I know you really irritated somebody that I'm going to have to deal with. So who is it now? Because he would have these different broadcasts, different interviews that he did, and some of those interviews were laced with colorful language. Invariably, somebody on my council or on part of the government or in the downtown especially, took exception to that. So I knew that right after Paul had walked in my office, that I was going to get a visit from somebody who was not going to walk in like that. It was an ongoing fight almost the entire time. And Paul would ask me, he said, why? And he said, first of all, why do you put up with me? I said, well, you know, first, I'm a student of history. I grew up, I was going to be a librarian. How I got to this, you know, into banking and then to be mayor, I really don't know. I didn't want to talk to anybody, I just wanted to read books. And I always loved the poets. The poets are like the soul seekers of a community. They don't always find it. And sometimes it's a little fractured when they start to bring it out. But they're always seeking it. And they're a necessary part of the soul of a community. And as I would explain to some of my council members, look, most poets that have really changed something, most of those that are really remembered, really irritated the heck out of everybody at some point in time. So if he's only irritating some people, you're not doing that badly. It was always an effort, and the intellectual stimulation of the community took a while. Is that a fair statement? Yeah. We worked together on a number of things, and I always tried to understand what he was looking to do. Sometimes not that successfully, because I've got my own perspective, and I had sometimes, like, you know, when we're in the middle of a recession, I didn't have a lot of things where I could help with. And a lot of times I had a council that wasn't really interested in doing anything whatsoever. But we always managed to do something and work it out, you know, and doing it together. Paul made an impact on the community every time that he touched it. And he touched it in a lot of different ways. I mean, there was a station, which was the center of things, but there was also these meetings and these labs and these poetry nights and coffee hours, and he'd always be coming up with something new and say, you know, and then he'd come in and say, well, you know, oh crap. I knew, I didn't know, but I was just about to. And he would have, but one of it was, he would always invite me, and I'd try as much as I could, as often as I could, to be available. I knew about his young daughter then, and I watch her progress still today. She is really a treasure. But Paul was the one who, in my most recent knowledge, and again, I've talked to a few, there's a newspaper board here that's got an edition of every paper ever written in this valley. I don't know another poet, first, that really affected the community positively, negatively. It woke them up. It always woke them up. And frankly, some of it got them started to do something. Now sometimes it was, they just came into my office to have a chat. But it really got them to think about it. They actually started to think about something that wasn't necessarily talked about before. And in a community that was as conservative as Auburn was, and it's changed, but it's still a little bit conservative against Seattle, a little bit. He made a tremendous difference, and he brought out some other poets in the area, brought them together, and he didn't just bring them together, he brought them out. So they started to expand out in the area. They were more seen, the works were more seen, and there was more opportunities. And little things started happening because of that. Just little strange things in Auburn, like for those of you who live around here, we started putting out pianos during the summer. It's not, and somebody, you know, that's not poetry, it's arts. Uniquely Auburn. How many people here, raise your hands, has ever heard of Uniquely Auburn? It is Uniquely Auburn. But it's not around anymore. We don't do it anymore simply because the people who really organized it got older. But it was a fascinating showcase for all things Auburn. And it was done by volunteers. And Paul was in that quite a bit as well. It gave opportunities for people to think about things in a different way that they ever had before. That's what poets do. That's what they're supposed to do. And I love the fact that he was always challenging whatever the norm was, even though that it meant that once a week or so, he'd come into my office and, well, you know. 25 years, congratulations, man. We've had good
So next up, we're going to have Jason Worth is going to give a talk. And Dr. Jason Worth is a professor of philosophy at Seattle University and works and teaches in the areas of continental philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, aesthetics, environmental philosophy, and Africana philosophy. His recent books include Mountains, Rivers, and the Great Earth, reading Gary Snyder and Dogen in an Age of Ecological Crisis, a monograph on Milan Kundera, commiserating with devastated things, and Schelling's Practice of the Wild. He is the associate editor and book review editor of the journal Comparative and Continental Philosophy. He was ordained in 2010 in Japan as a priest in the Soto Zen lineage and is the founder and co-director of the Seattle University Eco Sangha. Please welcome Jason Worth.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Very happy to be able to honor Paul. As you heard, I'm a philosophy professor and a Buddhist. Hopefully that's a good thing. It's what I do, and so my comment tonight will reflect that a little bit. But also I'd like to be very clear as I reflect on a simple question. What is an interview? Simple question. The simple never means easy. That's a false association. It's a simple question, but therefore very difficult. All I'll be talking about, but if it gets really obscure, just give me kind of a wrinkled look and I'll recalibrate. Paul Nelson is a master interviewer, and in that, we can see that the interview belongs to his poetic life and legacy. They are not about poetry and prophecy, but rather they are of poetry and prophecy. What does that mean? We must first clarify what we mean by the performance of the art of the interview. We inhabit a media world saturated with the decimation of language into journalistic facts. And in a time of fake news, routine executive office mendacity, and ubiquitous ideology, this seems, at least at first, like the best we can do. Democracy perishes in darkness, Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post tells us every day. Yeah, fair enough, indeed it does. But as important as these considerations are, they obscure the immense humiliation of language and the widespread degeneration of the gifts of writing and speaking. The interview at first glance just seems like the routine task of fact retrieval, and the latter, suffering their own extinction event right now, certainly seems and needs to be secured and protected. But we need to retrieve and reconsider how else we might appreciate the art of the interview. In order to do this, I would like to consider two practices of the interview that contest journalism's monopoly on the art of the interview. I'm not against journalism, I'm just simply saying they own the term, and I want to share it because it collapses the richness of what this term can mean. So I'll give two little counter examples. The first counter example is what we could broadly call the Zen interview. Oh God, here he goes again. But you know, Paul has a Zen practice. So I said, okay, a little loose association, I can go there. But it is a deep, deep legacy and tradition of thinking, what is an interview? And communicating in Zen is a really, really big deal. Now, if you're standing outside of Zen, this sounds like crazy. Like people are just saying these and you start saying like, oh wow, like in Zen, just go crazy and make no sense and get over logical thought. Never encourage Americans to get over logical thought. I should encourage them to begin with logical thought. I think it's a good thing. Don't give it up. Don't give it up before you've got it. Seems like on the outside, really it's a very surgical thought and tradition about what an interview is. This sometimes takes place in what's called Doksan. But what is Zen communication? What are we trying to do when we speak to each other, when we interview each other? The great Kamakura period Japanese Zen master Eihei Dogen explained that real communication requires the awakening and recasting of one's mind to be able to communicate and to be able to be communicated to. So if you have like some really deep Zen guy, and you have someone who doesn't know anything about anything, and they're going to communicate, that's like me saying, well, I'll just go to China, and I won't know any Chinese, but I'll just communicate widely. Well, it'll be obvious. A mind that speaks Chinese and a mind that does not know Chinese is not much communication. So you got to get the minds somehow to be in tune with each other. But since it's Zen, I don't mean in tune so you can change little facts back and forth or speak a language together or gossip together. A deep mind communicates when it recognizes the depth of another mind, when those two minds meet. Dogen was a very beautiful writer, called this Buddha to Buddha communication. The Buddha in me speaks to the Buddha in you. And it doesn't make any difference in what we say. The communication is when Buddha speaks to Buddha. And they can speak about anything, but the communication is coming from the depths of what we share when we communicate. Dogen also called this experience Ichibutsu Nibutsu. One Buddha, two Buddhas. As in, there's just really one Buddha there being shared by two people. That's communication. That's really deep. We strive for that in Zen. So in this sense, a Zen interview is not the transfer of information. It is a meeting of the minds, maybe even awakening of the mind, such that two people participate in the awakening of mind. A second model is just to take back the word interview itself, and I'll first start doing that by an etymological consideration. The word interview is an interesting word. I mean, it no longer is in common parlance, but originally it's very interesting. The term in English traces back to the early 16th century, borrowing the term from French, meaning something like a face-to-face meeting. From the French entrevue, to see each other, to visit each other briefly. Entre, between, voir, to see. Ultimately from the Latin videre, to see. In contemporary French, however, it's worth reflecting that you don't ever have any more an entrevue. It's like, I mean, like suddenly you just show up and you're a tourist and you sound like you learned this in school. But you know, no French person uses that. They use the word interview. And why do they do that? You know, they have an agency in France, and their job is to keep these damn American English words out of the French language, and they're always at it, and they're always losing, and it's a hopeless, it's Sisyphusian, the rock always rolls back down, and French is just giving way, and one day it'll be American English. And the word interview really reflects how the Americans understood this word, this face-to-face. You know, it was taken over in the late 19th century by the journalists. And it means generally, I think, by 1869, I think the good etymological detectives tell us, means something like conversation with someone to obtain statements for publication. You know, I want to get it, you know. What do you got? You know, it's almost as if I'm coming in there and saying, you know, I want to buy some intellectual capital, I'm going to just steal some stuff from you, or what do you got? I want to get it on paper, that's my job. And the first time this appears in American English, the reason why I say 1869, it's the first known use of interview in a journalistic sense, 1869, is the following sentence. defining interview. It's in the Nation magazine, January 28, 1869. The interview, in quotation marks, as at present managed, is generally the joint product of some humbug of a hack politician and another humbug of a newspaper reporter. American English is taking over the earth. There we go. There it is at work. So yeah, just junk getting junk from junk in a big circle of junk. And that is interview. The naivete of journalistic interviewing is, as the model of the Zen interview already indicates, that A, the interview has as motivation the collection of information. That's what we're trying to do. If it is just information, anyone can understand it, or learn to be able to understand, just get the facts. And B, the question of the meaning of minds is irrelevant. You know, I mean, you already bring things back down to the humbug to humbug level. You know, the interview was the other way around. Preciousness, really, of face-to-face. You know, one of my favorite philosophers once said, you know, meeting another person, just seeing someone face-to-face, that's our deepest approximation of our own death. So deep and so mysterious is it to be in the same space, and when two faces look at each other, what do they say? What are we really to say? What is it to be face-to-face? However, if we keep listening to this word, interview, the the French entre, speaks, if you just listen to what the word's saying, of a between, a third, that holds together the face-to-face. Now, what is between us as we look at each other? What is between us as we attempt to speak to each other? What is between us when I ask you a question or you give me an answer? What is between us? What is this between? I think that's a really, really, really hard issue. What is the nature of this in-between such that if it is not there, the interviewer reduces the interviewee to a transmitter of information and reduces the transmission itself to mere information? There's either, we already know what we want to do, give me what I need, I already know how to handle it, give it to me right now, and we'll be done with our business. Do I write you a check? It's business. You know, that will be there if the between is not there. So what is this space that disappears or is carried over? We run in there and simply say, it's a business transaction. We know how to speak to each other. We know how to speak from this between that we share. We can hearken. I love that word hearken. I mean, try to listen better. Try to listen better. It's a great word. Get hearing really to hear more carefully. We can hearken to this in-between by simply reflecting on the fact that Paul Nelson interviewed poets and other prophets. Just think about that for a minute. What does it mean that he chose to interview those who, by poets and prophets? I mean, whatever, if it's a person known as a poet, or if it's just a person trying to think about their life in Auburn, you know, is very careful about trying really to hear these voices. Well, what does it mean to reflect on that? That Paul Nelson interviewed poets and other prophets. Well, let's put it through the back door. What happens if the poetic voice degenerates into the deliverance of opinions, gossip, and information? Let's just say what happens there. What if we just interview them in the journalistic sense, in other words? Just share information. You would have to say then that the biggest loss would be that the fact of poetry disappears in the mere communication of facts, even if they were facts about poetry. If there is at stake the mere transmission of facts, poetry itself would automatically become superfluous. Why are you poeticizing? Just give me the facts. You know, why all this wild, eccentric stuff? Just cut to the chase. You know, just send me a text. Poetry from this perspective then appears like an eccentric conveyance of facts by extravagant and otherwise irrelevant means. To hearken to poetry then, one has to hearken to what it is that only poetry can do. Why is it poetry? Why aren't you saying, let's go to a fact reading tonight? Or, I'm a poet and what I do is I write for the Washington Post. No, what is it that makes poetry poetry and not something else? There are many ways to inform people, and poetry cannot compete with our dizzying array of electronic information delivery devices. Just Google it and put the poet out of her misery. Yet this dazzling array of communication recalls how Henry David Thoreau in Walden characterized the advent of the telegraph. Improved means to unimproved ends. I love Thoreau. It is quaint to think that the telegraph was once considered efficient, but the world of information on demand demonstrates the prophetic force of this critique. We can, with increasing, even sublime efficiency, communicate almost instantly with each other. But this just magnifies the nature of our self-deception. We still do not have anything to communicate. We have nothing to say, but man, oh man, can we say it all the time now, rapidly. We still don't have anything to communicate, even though we can transmit our vacuous verbosity with lightning speed. We can communicate faster and more often in an endless proliferation in which we tacitly, by what we're doing, confess that we have little to say, and so we'll drown out the silence between us in a din of relentless verbiage. Talking and talking and talking so we don't have to have that space between us. Remember, this philosophy compared it to death even. It's a scary space. You're vulnerable before it. It is creation. It is thought. It is the land. The land speaks, but it's not information. Land does not speak by, you don't interview the land and it gives you information about itself. One of the spokes of the Buddha's Eightfold Path is consummate speech. That is, understanding the full power of communication and not defiling it with aggressive verbal assault that overwhelms the silence and fills the space between us. The poetic word protects this space, nourishes this silence, and takes its strength from the in-between. It does not report. It creates, speaking from this bottomless space that we share. It's our land, it's our language, it's our life together. But we can rephrase the problem at hand like this. How does one come face to face with the poet and the prophet in an interview? The journalist fails to appreciate that the poet means just what she says. And it's not a fact. What does poetry mean? Poetry means what it says. The poem does not mean something besides what it says, as if it were encrypted, waiting for the journalist to decrypt it and report to the authorities what its hidden facts were. That's not what it is to read a poem. In Patterson, for example, William Carlos Williams clarifies, and I quote, "The poet thinks with his poem. In that lies his thought, and that in itself is the profundity." The poem, simply as the poem, is how we nourish the space of the in-between, and that is how we interview each other. To approach his poem, to approach the poetic mind of the other, to come face to face with poet and prophet, one has to enter the in-between, out of which poetry and prophecy emerge. In a sense, one has to enter the in-between of mind itself, out of which poetic minds emerge. It is, how do we say this? Going back to Dogen, but varying it. It is poet-to-poet communication. Or with Dogen again, with another variation, one poet and two poets. That's what an interview is. One poet and two poets. That is, two poets realizing their mutual interdependence in the great expanse of the poetic mind. The interview as practiced by Paul Nelson is not reportage. It is a dance between listener and speaker where those roles alternate and shape each other and allow the in-between to emerge with the shape and intensity specific to that dance and to its dancers. The listener has to know, first of all, who merits an interview, whose mind has its roots in archaic wisdom, but whose fruits also feed the spiritually and culturally hungry of our shared life in the here and now. It has to have a sense of what is worth asking, and has to do so in such a way that it allows the answers to shape one's further inquisitive responses. This is not the extraction of information for public consumption, but rather a display of the poetic in-between at work and play. As such, the Nelsonian interview means what it says. And therein lies its thought, and that in itself is its profundity. We owe a great debt of gratitude to Paul Nelson, and we celebrate tonight the artifacts of this ancient yet strikingly contemporary dance in which the poetic mind, as the great in-between of the poetic fact of the face-to-face. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Next up, we're going to bring Paul up to have a little Q&A with some of the members of the SPLAB board.
Anyone else have a question?
And anyone else who has a question. Let me just say a word about Paul. I've met Paul about 5 years ago via the Postcard Poetry Festival. And linked up with him on Facebook and have grown to know him over the years. And he's, in addition to interviewing scores of poets and prophets from the likes of Allen Ginsberg and Nate Mackey and Brenda Hillman and Ann Waldman, and also Beaver Chief, as well as we see in the collection American Prophets. Paul's a champion of open form, of kind of playful mind in his poetics that kind of stems out of finding your own kind of inner space and radiating from that and doing it again and again and again. And it's not about perfecting, it's about practice, which some of the things you might see in his collection American Sentences, of doing the sentence day after day after day. It's coming back to that space and that center of life, and it's an impressive thing, and an impressive collection of work. And we're glad to be celebrating you tonight, Paul. We want to bring you up and hear a little bit from you. So.
What a great thing it is. I'm so humbled by that. I wanted to go to this page here to get some sense of the collection that's been donated to the museum. So, doing cataloging with museum quality is a very difficult task. It took a lot of time. And so this is the extension, or this should be the extent of what the museum has, and that's the most recent one, and then it kind of goes down and goes down and goes down. Keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. So you get some kind of sense of what's here and how there were 16 bankers boxes full of stuff, and most of the stuff was recorded in Auburn, especially once we got the studios here. So that's splab.org/listen. You can see the URL, so you can go to that. And if, you know, you can see links to the actual, reel. I scanned all those that had to be scanned, and then links to some of the audio. And then this other browser tab I have up here is the current landing site for interviews. And right now it's, please buy the book, is basically what it's saying. It has a quote from Sam. I was very, Sam was a person I met because I had a radio show, and because I also worked at KPLU, so I got a chance to meet people like Sam Hamill and others through this effort. And this is the landing page. So when I do a new interview, I will put it up here in alphabetical order, and you can see different links. So you see the A's start here. And each of those is a page that goes to a landing page. And again, it goes on and on. There's a great picture of George Bowering. I love that. Wearing a Motorhead t-shirt. You can see why Mayor Lewis is talking about how I got into trouble with language here. And it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. So those two, if you're interested in the interviews, those two URLs are the best places to start. So, I mean, this is a humbling thing to be here and to hear all this, your beautiful talk. Barbara, just hearing you say that sentence that Rebecca wrote was one of the points of admission. Mr. Mayor, just all the support that you gave SPLAB over the years. We wouldn't be here today talking about years if you hadn't been a supporter. I mean, it's just that basic. My family, I have 2 family members who came here from Chicago. My sister Barb here, and my mom, Lesbia Nelson. And if you go to the website, you can see the blog posts on the right, the recent blog posts, and there's one about my mom. It's the one, Unconventional Nelson, right there. So you want to know a little bit about her, that's one place to go. So I'm really grateful that they came slog on the way out here to be here and part of this evening. So thank you. All right, thanks, Mom. So we were going to do a Q&A, and we do have to be out of here at 8:45 just to be good guests. Thank you all for coming. I know a lot of people came a long way to be part of this. Annika Klicks helped with the editing of the book. Annika made it. Thank you for being here. We have your copy of the book right over here. We also have copies for sale if you haven't got it yet. So Matt, where do we start?
I mean, kind of building off of Jason's talk, one of the things I came to in poetry, when I first got started, I read these lots of collections of interviews, and I remember Ted Berrigan talking about how the interview is a kind of a medium in and of itself that's different from the poetry, but they both kind of interplay with each other. So I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about what the interview and the art of interviewing has taught you about poetry as much as poetry has taught you about interviews.
I'm going to get this bag to demonstrate a little bit. First of all, I interviewed, does anyone remember the New Age book from I think it was the 80s called The Celestine Prophecy?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I interviewed James Redfield, and he said, I think he said it in the book or said it somewhere else, if you don't see auras and want to see auras, hang out with people who do. I thought that was great. And I think that, if you want to be a poet and you don't think your poetry is as good as it could be, interview poets. And so, you get, and when you have a syndicated radio show, publishing houses are just sending you books. Hey, please interview this guy. And I get this book and I'm going, holy shit, I have a chance to interview Allen Ginsberg. Damn right I'll do it, and I'll get a very cool autograph too. So if there's never going to be a fire at our house, but were there ever be a fire, this is the first thing, I think, that we take. Pictures next. And, just having Ginsberg, just looking at him, and he would look in my eyes, and I didn't know shit about poetry when I interviewed him. He would look, he'd mention something and see if there was any glimmer of recognition. And there wasn't much. And I told Clayton Neshelman the story, and he said, no, he was just looking to see if he could sleep with you that night. I'm not sure if that was true, but maybe somewhere in the middle. And then I get this book, this landed at 520 F Street Southeast here in Auburn. Consider interviewing this guy, Michael McClure. Sounds vaguely familiar. Oh, he played with Ray Manzarek. Yeah, I'll have to interview this guy. And so I take this book into the woods to Olympic National Park, not the time that I got lost, but when I was working on that. And I read this. He gave me a nice autograph too, with a nice face on there. I read this, and I'm reading this at 5,000 feet at Appleton Pass. And actually, it was above Appleton Pass. I went to what I later learned was the top of a mountain. It just looked like a pre-peak, but it was actually a mountain. I forget the name of it. Tim McNulty knows the name of it. And I'm reading these words and looking over this watershed that we had hiked through, the Boulder Creek watershed, pristine. We saw bears there. There's a spring there. And I see these words on the page, and they were spread out in capitalized and double spaced, and going down the page, more alive than I ought to be. And I read that, and I looked out, and it's like, I think I know what he's getting at. At least here's one version. And then he continues, more alive than I ought to be. Oceans and freeways of grief and guilt, triumphs of bare feet and drugs up the nose, child of cocaine and raccoons and hollow logs, fusus cryptestae filet. Nature loves to hide herself in Leonardo's secret language and the dimensions that disappeared after the bang. Old men dreaming of great-grandfathers are very wise, like sow bugs and wooden spools wound with scarlet thread, and an antlered buck that drinks from a bowl in the yard in moon shadows. I was like, fuck, I want to write something like that. So that's what you want to do. You want to surround yourself with people who, in my friend Aze's words, have some juice for you. And this really, I mean, interviewing Ginsberg and then the next year interviewing McClure, that's a 1-2 punch that I don't think anyone ever recovers from. Just fantastic. So that's part of the motivation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, kind of building off the interview with Ginsberg that's in the American Prophets, you both talk kind of extensively about this concept of first thought, best thought. And it's something that you kind of give out to people for the August Postcard Poetry Festival each year to kind of help them kind of get into this mindset of shutting off the filters and just kind of sitting down and writing what's in front of you. I wonder if you might talk about that concept a little bit and your interactions with Alan and.
Well, Alan talked about it on the air. If I go down here, Alan said it really well himself, and I think I could. This is kind of hard to manage a little bit, but Alan, we have this. Now, see, this is all the way. I'm not getting it quite, or it's. No, well, it doesn't seem to be working right, so I'll just kind of leave it at that. I will say this. Alan talked about first thought, best thought, and it doesn't mean the first chronological thought. The first thought would be superficial. It's sort of like when you see the water. I have this image of the stuck river when I do this. But you wait, you stir things up, and you wait until the dirt kind of goes away, and then you have a thought. Now it's not a thought about thinking; it's an actual thought, and you begin to trust that. I mean, that's what the Postcard Fest is about: how to train yourself to trust that first thought. And there are people, who've expanded on what he's done and gone deeper than what he's done. People like Robert Duncan, Denise Levertov, Charles Olson, Jack Spicer. So we know these names. And the interesting thing for me is that when you learn to train your writing in that way, that you're much more comfortable with. You do a lot of the revision before the moment, and you prepare yourself for the moment, and then you kind of ride the moment as best you can. We've all had the experience of something coming very naturally to us. Even when it comes to cooking, I mean, there are people who say, I have to measure out a tablespoon of this, and there are people that just kind of madly moving things in. And, as long as you can eat your mistakes, you're going to learn how to cook that way, right? Well, as long as you don't show anybody what you write, if it doesn't come out well, then you can learn to write that way. And the more interesting thing about it to me is that it not only becomes a way of writing or a way of cooking, but it becomes a way of living. right? It becomes not a poetics, but a cosmology. How can I be guided by a force that's greater than me? So as I'm living in a place like Auburn, right, a traditional place, you use the word conservative, I would use the word traditional, right? How does that merge this notion of being guided by some of the most, in poetry, by some of the most outside people, relate to a place like Auburn? Well, I ended up playing softball with guys who were at the Calvary Temple, right? And when I get lost in the woods, I find out later that they're praying to make sure that I get back safely. And my friend Mark Johnson, when I got lost in the woods, had to be rescued by a military helicopter. He said, as soon as I heard you were lost in the woods, I thought, God's got Paul's attention. Right? Which is a beautiful way of saying it. So how does all this avant stuff relate to someone who goes to the Calvary Temple, which was a traditional place? It was a Jerry Falwell Assembly of God kind of church. They find a way to be guided by something greater than themselves. So there is a kind of merging of two ideas, two different minds, to find the middle ground. And I was living that middle ground, because I'm here in Auburn interviewing people like Ginsberg and McClure and Larry Dawson and everyone else. So to see how it evolved into a way of living my life has been probably the most important lesson I got out of doing any of this. And the fact that it happened in Auburn is really important, because how does it translate to someone who lives here in a traditional place? And it worked as well as it was going to work, I think. And it worked, the organization continued because of people like Pete Lewis and Kent Pullen, rest his soul, and Chris Vance, who you would think my politics and his don't line up, but he saw what we were trying to do here and supported it with money, which, let me tell you, helps a great deal. Helps a great deal. As we are trying to raise money to do a festival in Anacortes, we see even a little bit. We can do a lot with even just a little bit of money. So I hope that made some sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And then kind of like, I wonder if maybe you would talk about that particular element, that tapping into something greater than yourself, and then the kind of practice of seriality that you talk about in here with Nate Mackey, and you're always kind of talking about as well.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, sir. Seriality and, well, you know what, if you want to learn about what seriality is, read the Mackey interview in the book, because he says it as well as it can be said. But one of the things about seriality that really interests me, I mean, you could look at the American sentences as a serial effort, because I write one every day, and you can see the track, and they're listed there chronologically. So you can see the track of my intimate relationship, for example. Oh, that's when it started to crash, and that's where it crashed right there. It starts to crash I'm not going to say the one where it starts to crash, but it crashed when I have an American sentence that goes, 3 days after the split, I revert to a diet of cake and meat. Right? And that's an actual thing, because I was invited to Bill Pelosi's house for the election night party, and I got out, hung late, and I was depressed because I just broken up. And they had pound cake and meatballs. And they're like, take some home. For 3 days. So it's not just something I made up. So reading Mackey about seriality is the best place to learn about that. And I think that his point of how you can go to something and not be definitive, but it's the most open form of poetry that I've ever encountered. And the fact that Jose Kozer, who I interviewed in this, and he talks about seriality in that, he came to the serial form with no idea that Duncan and Spicer were talking about it 40 years early. So how there's that kind of coincidence that happens to me is validation for that stance.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I would recommend anybody to check out the Nate Mackey interview here as well. It's really great.
The most recent one in the book is the Mackey one.
Yeah. So maybe it's a good opportunity to open up to take a question or two from the audience.
Joe and then Pete.
Hey, Paul. I noticed that a lot of the interviews were done with Coleman and Brenda Hillman and Mackey as a part of the Poetry Festival. So you had a chance to interact with these folks for a couple of days. So I wondered how that changed your interviews and how it informed your, or stories that you have around the context around some of these interviews, because you were with these people for long periods of time, which a lot of people don't get a chance to do.
Yeah, well, you know, like Jerome Rothenberg, Wanda Coleman, and others, we brought to town. We brought to Auburn through the Visiting Poets series. So, you know, I would pick them up at the airport. We'd go to the Sunbreak Cafe, and, you know, Ed Sanders was like, "I got to take a picture of this. This is the biggest pancake I've ever seen. It's going over the plate. I'm going to take a picture of this." So Ed Sanders is taking a picture of me in front of the pancake at the Sunbreak. So, you know, you'd pick him up, you'd have lunch at the Sunbreak, he'd do a workshop, there'd be a reading, maybe we'd go into the schools, and then at the end of it, before they got back on the plane and went to New York or LA or wherever they came from, that's when I would do the interview. So I would have the whole weekend of engaging with them, making mental notes about the interesting things that I thought they did, and trying to bring out their essence, trying to bring out their you know, the method behind the madness. So, yeah, there was definitely a formula to it. And there was so much teaching, not just learning about poetry, but Rothenberg, to that person who I had the cake and meat breakup with, Rothenberg said, when I was working at KPLU and I couldn't be with him, I had to go do my radio shift at the jazz station. He said, "You know, Paul picked me up at the airport, he hosted the workshop, he brought me to the school. I came here expecting to see a community of peers. And it's been Paul doing this, Paul doing that, Paul doing this." And it really was, you know, it was a real eye-opening moment, is that I can go so far on doing all this myself, but I need to develop a community of peers. And I am getting closer to having that perfected, but it's a lot better than it was. Matt Treese, who's running this tonight, because Jared Lysing couldn't because he hurt his foot yesterday, stepping in and doing it as well as it possibly can be done. Joe Shivany, who's our board president of SPLAB, who also does the cooking for the festivals, so actually feeding the poets. The McBreens here, I guess your dad, oh, there he is in the back. The McBreens, who took over from when I said, SPLAB's not going to do poetry here anymore, and you can't use the name SPLAB, they started Striped Water Poets and continued it, the tradition of poetry happening right in downtown Auburn. You know, so you hear these criticisms, you take them to heart when they're really criticisms, when they're not just somebody trying to, you know, cut you down or be a social justice warrior or whatever, and you take them to heart and you try and address them. And you know, I'm really happy with the progress of how that's gone. So that's my answer.
Well, just as a final, Alan Ginsberg at the end of your interview said, "Thank you for your tolerance and letting me breathe." Shows that.
Yeah, and something that I think Jason alluded to is there's a imam in town, Jamal Rahman, and after the interview that happened in Auburn, it was one in Auburn at 14 South Division, he said, and it wasn't on the air, it was after, he said, "I appreciate the sacred nature with which you conducted this interview." And I'm like, yeah, I do with that. No one's ever worded it like that, but it really resonated, and it was a beautiful compliment. And obviously I remember it 20 years later, so it was a pretty striking moment. Yeah, Mr. Lewis.
So, because I always did, now that you're not getting money from me, where are you getting your funding from now? Besides, For Culture's got to be in there someplace, but there's got to be other fundraising efforts as well.
Well, without the For Culture money, the book doesn't happen, and the archive doesn't get done in such a way, in such a beautiful way. But you can see the For Culture logo on there, and I'm glad that you represented For Culture. Doreen couldn't be here tonight, and I'm thinking they should be here. They've been funding us from the beginning, and it was easier getting For Culture money down here because they fund South King County. About 7% of their budget goes to South King County, and South King County has 33% of its population. Now granted, you've got the museum and the opera and the aquarium, and you've got all these cultural institutions downtown, but it's a huge discrepancy. So they've been under the gun in the last year to do something about that. So they helped fund the book and get the book out. We're doing a fest in Anacortes, and you do not spend King County money in Anacortes. So we were just notified of an award of $3,250 from the lodging tax fund in Anacortes. We were just notified of $1,500 from ArtsWA, which is the state arts commission. We're hoping for a $1,000 grant from Humanities Washington. But these are not the kind of grants that we were used to getting. You know, there's a letter, you can find it somewhere on the website, on the SPLAB.org/listen. Jim Kelly, here's $15,000 to help you build your studio. Those are checks that you can, you know, do a lot with when they come up with 15 grand. So we're doing it, you know, any way we can. 1,000 here, 1,500 here, depending on box office receipts to make some of the bills for the fest as well. So it's, you know, you go through cuticles quite often with this kind of fundraising. It was easier in Auburn.
But I just want to jump in and say, I hate to see so much of your energy devoted to trying to scrape up the money. You know, that to me is a waste of what somebody like you should be doing. And it isn't just poets also, I wish, didn't have to just rely on government funding, little government grants here and there. Governments never have enough to apportion to the arts. I'd really like to see business, which is doing very well in this area right now, thank you very much. I'd really like to see them step up and do their share in giving back to community to the arts. So if anybody knows anybody at some big corporation, let's give it to Paul.
Well, I'm with you on that. We have a plan, however. First of all, there's a company in downtown Seattle that wouldn't even have to give us money, but just bring awareness to a program like the August Postcard Poetry Fest. So it costs $10 to get in, and we raised $2,930 last year with the festival. So I thought, why don't we get 1,000 people next year to do the festival? That's 10 grand of revenues. And then within 5 years, why don't we get 10,000 people to do the festival? Which certainly there's 10,000 people on this planet, even on this continent, who want to do it. Imagine it as a 7th grade summer vacation project, right? So that's why we brought all these cards out here. To, you know, so if you know someone, and it doesn't have to be a poet. We've all written postcards. So the ultimate goal is to get 10,000 people to do this festival and have revenues of $100,000 a year, and then we don't have to worry. All this other stuff that comes in would be the icing, and this would be the kick right here. So having Amazon promote this is something we're actively trying to do. Their call for applications for funding ends tomorrow, and the guy who runs that, Neil Thompson, he is hopefully going to hear about the notion of Amazon supporting the postcard. We don't even need money necessarily, although I certainly would take a check. Right now, about a check for $5,000 would really come in handy. But Amazon has the ability to get awareness to at least 10,000 people who would do this fest. So that would be the answer to that. And then the grants that we've been getting would just be gravy for it.
Well, I want to thank everyone for questions, and thank you, Paul, for answering. But we want to hear some poems from you.
And it just so happens that my friend Jim O'Halloran here is my brother and collaborator, and he brought his flute. Did he not? Yes, he brought his flute. So thanks, Matt, for that. And I think giving Matt a hand for the job that he did. And then keep it going for Jim as we welcome my brother Jim O'Halloran. And we're going to do this poem. You probably followed the story of Tahlequah, the whale mom who lost her calf half an hour after it was born and pushed it around the Savior's Sea for 17 days. I was tasked after day 4 to write a poem about it, and I did. And then after day 5, I edited it. So it's been 5 days, so I'll edit it. But I wasn't going to edit it after 6 and 7. Everybody knows it was 17 days. And so this is a poem called Elegy for Tahlequah's Calf. is daughter of Princess Angeline, brother of Moby, sister to Kiki, mother to Notch. Her second offspring was not born, but born still, and still unnamed and unnumbered. For 5 days Tahlequah pushed her stillborn calf around the Salish Sea, perhaps a hope that she'd not be a parent to bury a child, perhaps a grief vigil, the unnamed, unnumbered calf riding dead on her rostrum 5 days. Tahlequah, Cherokee for plains, or a kind of red rice, or just two, or two is enough, or a ferry terminal on Vashon. 5 days, says the witness from the Whale Museum, sitting Shiva and watching her deep breaths. She carried the dead calf 20 miles one day in her teeth from time to time through the full, ripe thimbleberry moon through stage 1 grief denial. We are going to be here as long as necessary for her. Here is what your ferry line idling of your giant truck brings. 108.7 degree low temperatures in Kiryat Oman. 11 fires in the Arctic Circle. Mama whales pushing around their stillborn calves 5 days. But you stayed cool in your air-conditioned life. You had bigger fish to fry than whales who have no lobby. You idled that engine until the last glacier died, the last salmon leapt, and last forest burned. These are the stories the children of our children will tell, if there are storytellers in their time. How we slept at the switch, ignored the clear signs of doom. How we were scholars of war and good tweeters. Had nice dinner photographs and saved ourselves from Muslims and immigrants and every vague threat the cruel majority could conjure, while the world burned and one whale mom did all our crying for us. Jim O'Halloran. I have some books if you're interested in buying them, and we have to be out of here in about 10 minutes or so. That's the ideal thing. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to talk to anyone, less publicly, and I'm grateful for this evening. Just really humbling, and really grateful for everyone came.